streaming live.
All right, Pat, you're on.
You want me to start?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Pat McKay, and I'm the chair of the North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are very excited to host our very first webinar entitled Conversations About Sex Trafficking. And we have two of the most knowledgeable speakers on this issue with us tonight. I know you'll learn a lot from them and hopefully gain a better understanding of the issue and how our community, our state, and our nation are dealing with this issue. But first, just a little bit about our organization. I began my journey to learn all I could about human trafficking in 2009. At that time, Alabama, and more specifically North Alabama, did not have anything in place in order to fight these crimes. We lacked even basic knowledge about human trafficking, no state laws, and no infrastructure in our communities to address the issue. So I started this task force to educate people on what human trafficking is, what it is not, what it looks like, and how large the issue is in our area. Most people don't even realize that sex trafficking is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world, second only behind the sale of drugs. I'm proud to say that the North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force became an official 501c3 nonprofit organization earlier this year. We did this because we realized that we needed to have this formal nonprofit designation to enable us to do more for our community. Among other projects, our plans are to have these virtual meetings on a quarterly basis to bring awareness to the issue. So again, tonight, we present our very first virtual webinar, Conversations About Sex Trafficking. Tonight's speakers are both experts on this issue and work diligently to educate, investigate these crimes, and recover victims whenever possible. Both of our speakers have also presented at the annual Alabama Human Trafficking Summit, which is sponsored by the State Human Trafficking Task Force. And we couldn't think of anyone else that we would rather have to kick off our first virtual webinar. So now let me introduce our speakers. First, I want to introduce Doug Gilmer. He is the Assistant Special Agent in Charge for Homeland Security Investigations for the state of Alabama. He has an extensive background in national security, counterterrorism, and human trafficking investigations. He is a fierce warrior in the fight against human trafficking, and we are all proud of his heart as well as his actions related to this issue. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Pat. It's good to be here.
Next, I want to introduce Joe Scaramucci. He is a detective with the McLennan County, Texas Sheriff's Office. Joe is also a nationally recognized expert on human trafficking and is certified by the courts of law as a subject matter expert. He has investigated and made arrests throughout the United States, Canada, China, New Zealand, and Guatemala. He is also a consultant to Polaris Project, providing training to agencies throughout the United States, as well as technical support for their human trafficking operations and investigations. Because of all of that he has done to assist our state in so many ways, Alabama has basically adopted him as one of our own. Welcome, Joe.
Hey, thanks. I'm getting on a plane right now.
Great. Both Doug and Joe are career law enforcement. They have worked on both state and federal investigations involving human trafficking. They are frequent speakers on the subject and often provide training for other law enforcement and nonprofit groups on the subject. Thank you both for agreeing to speak with us tonight. The format for tonight's webinar will be questions and answers. We have prepared several questions for our speakers. As you already know, we are live streaming to our Facebook page. And if you have any questions, please type your question in the comment area on our Facebook page, and we will try to include them with time permitting, of course. So let's get started. So I'm going to ask the question, and whoever wants to jump in can just jump in. How's that? And then the next one will alternate. So my first question for both of you really tonight is, what is human trafficking and what are the trends you've been seeing lately? Okay, Doug, start. I guess I have to orchestrate, sorry.
So long and short, human trafficking is it's a crime of exploitation. So whether it is sex trafficking or labor trafficking, in short, it involves the use or threatened use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain services such as labor or sex from an individual. That's the long and short, or that's the short answer as to what human trafficking is. It comes in many different forms. It's not always so cut and dry. I like to tell people that sex trafficking is always labor trafficking, but labor trafficking isn't always sex trafficking. Labor trafficking could be anything from forced child labor to domestic servitude. Really kind of runs the gamut of services that a person could be exploited for, whether it's in the hospitality industry, agriculture, manufacturing, whatever the case might be. And of course, sex trafficking is the same thing. It's just that the service that's being provided is sexual services. And again, that can take many different shades. It could be, it could involve a person being exploited online, in a hotel room, in a home, in an illicit, massage parlor. It really runs the gamut.
So Joe, let me ask the other part of that question. What are the trends you've been seeing lately?
Trends is a kind of difficult thing to gauge.
Tough word.
Right now. Do what?
It's a tough word.
It is. So at least what I'm seeing, the trends have pretty much maintained throughout COVID. There hasn't really been a substantial change one way or another, really, from much in the world of trafficking. By and large, as Doug said, you have your two main forms, which is sex and labor. For sex trafficking, the overwhelming majority is domestic in nature. It's American citizens, whereas the overwhelming majority of labor trafficking, for the most part, is international victims. All the kids know at the age of 16 when they go get their first job what their rights are. You can't do this, you can't do that. People coming from foreign countries, especially ones that are coming from turmoil, don't necessarily see it the same way. So those kind of trends have been consistent, pre-COVID and post-COVID. There's only so many ways that you can buy and sell human beings. And I don't care what the particular venue is, you can only do it so many ways. So it stays pretty consistent, I think, for the most part. Kind of to what Doug said, the internet, there has been a little rise, I think, in cam-based trafficking and maybe pornography-based trafficking, just because of the ease, and everybody's so used to this world of this virtual world now. So
yes. So what do you see as the biggest misunderstanding on what human trafficking is or what it isn't? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, I would say, and again, that's a multifaceted question. one of the biggest misconceptions is that it's not happening where I'm at. It's not happening in my community. That's a big misconception, because we know what happens, pretty much everywhere. People tend to have a stereotype because of the media, of what human trafficking is and isn't. We think of the movie Taken, and people think that that's the world of human trafficking. In reality, it's not. That's not to say that it may not happen that way in some parts of the world, but that's not typically the way that it happens here. The white van syndrome, where people get scared and panicked about white vans driving in their neighborhood, or somebody following them around Walmart, and they make the Facebook posts about how this person is just, waiting to kidnap my kid and sell them into a sex trafficking ring. That's just not the way it happens. And another big misconception, or a big misunderstanding too, and the media cannot get this right. And I saw an article just today out of California. There's a difference between human smuggling and human trafficking. Human smuggling is a crime against the border. Human trafficking is a crime against a person, long and short. So trafficking doesn't involve transportation. It, as an element, it can, but not as an element of the actual offense. You don't have to transport a person in order to traffic that person. But just in the news today in Anaheim, California, there was an article that hit the news about Anaheim police shooting a suspect in a human trafficking operation. Well, when you read the story, it's not a human trafficking operation. It was a human smuggling operation in which they were holding subjects for ransom in a house. And it really had nothing to do with trafficking. It was all smuggling, but the media still can't get that right.
Joe, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for the sake of transparency, I agree with Doug 100%. I also think oftentimes it's law enforcement that's shooting ourselves in the foot because we like media clicks from administrative and from public information officer standpoints. And, if that particular story said something about, some people being held for ransom for smuggling, it wouldn't have the same mystique and sex appeal as trafficking venue. So I think that's important, to bring up as well. And, one of the biggest things that I see is what do we educate the public on? And the reality is that we educate the public. You can go to Google right now. I challenge everybody to go to Google and type in human trafficking and click images. It's going to be nothing but Caucasian females with blue eyes, blonde hair, their hands bound together with rope or some chains. And, what can we do to end human trafficking? And that's not what human trafficking looks like, right? There's blonde hair, blue eyed girls, don't get me wrong. But by and large, it's women of color. It's not what the media necessarily portrays it to be. So, we're all looking at one thing, kind of to echo what Doug said in regards to the white vans, but it's not really happening that way.
Okay, next question. How has COVID-19 affected human trafficking? Anybody?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Joe.
So there's a lot of discussion around this that I've seen. I can tell you that at least throughout the state of Texas, we monitor incoming messages from buyers on a daily basis. That number never really fluctuated throughout COVID. When we look at sex ads, the amount of ads, give or take, at different times fluctuated, but not enough to blame on COVID. I think it's going to be several years before we're ever actually able to say that this happened because of COVID, because we're going to have to deal with victims later outcrying and then saying, hey, look, I got, in a position of vulnerability because of COVID, and this is what happened to me. When we look at illicit massage parlors, There was discussion very early on from some organizations saying, well, we think that basically IMB trafficking is over with because storefronts are closed. In all forms of trafficking, I just like to look at things very basic. And my basic question to all forms of trafficking is, if the fear of being robbed, if the fear of STDs and AIDS, if the fear of going to prison for sex trafficking is not enough to deter you from trafficking or buying sex, COVID is not going to do that. So that's what we've seen. We have seen an increase in reports to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Arguably, that happens every year. So I think we'll have to really map out what's happened in 2020 to see how it plays out. But I think it's going to take some time.
Doug, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that, early on when, and again, this probably varies from state to state, but when we kind of had the shutdown, early on, when the cases were just, really kind of exploding in growth, here in Alabama, we saw a decrease in activity. I know just locally we went a few weeks without getting really a single new tip or new lead on a case. Now that could just be coincidence. But then some of the girls that we know that are out, on the street and that kind of thing, they told us that, business pretty much came to a stop for them for a couple of weeks. We did see a big decline as far as the illicit massage parlors go, because they were all closed in the state of Alabama. They were mandated to be closed. And to this day, a number of those have not reopened. So I think they probably went out of business, or they closed and were closed long enough that they cut their losses. Some are starting to pop back open again. But at least for a while, they were shut down. And like I said, many didn't return. So and to echo Joe, we did see an increase in the number of cases after a while, not initially, but as time went on, we did start seeing an increase in the number of cases involving child exploitation and, that kind of thing.
Thank you. I'm sorry I interrupted. We have a question from the audience. What demographic is most at risk for becoming a trafficking victim? Who wants to take that?
I'm a statistics guy, so I'm a studying statistics guy, and I think arguably a good chunk of them are garbage statistics, and so I think the best that I've been able to see is about, and again trying to vet certain studies, but about a 40% ratio of trafficking victims being African American females. There's some kind of old numbers out there that talk about, the average age of entry being 14. That particular study was conducted of nothing but juveniles. So naturally that's a lower number. And that one was in excess of 20 years ago. It still refers to child prostitutes. So the best that I've been able to see through, and again, it's all self-reporting numbers. The only way we can get really substantial numbers is through self-reporting, is about a 17 to 18-year-old African-American female.
Yeah. And I would say too, I agree with everything that Joe just said. I would also not get fixated on a particular demographic, because it really has nothing to do with a particular ethnicity. It really has to do with a person's vulnerability. And if they're vulnerable and they're easily targeted, that's what really makes them easy prey for the traffickers. So,
Agree.
I mean, we've had girls from very affluent homes that, you know, were in a vulnerable position due to, it could be substance abuse or low self-esteem or whatever the case might be. You know, just like we've had, you know, people from minority communities, you know, being targeted and being trafficked.
Okay, and this one's for Joe because I've been watching his social media posts. There have been many or a few myths that have surfaced on social media about human trafficking recently. You gave me this, I mean, basically. Please talk about what is actually true and what is simply myth.
Man,
this is what you get for posting on Facebook.
I know. You know, if organizations are telling you that, you know, we have to watch the fact that our kids are getting kidnapped off the streets left and right and plucked out of their schools and their safe homes, I think we're missing the point. And there's a lot of, you know, do kids get kidnapped? They do in the United States. Does it happen often? It does not. Do kids that are kidnapped end up in trafficking? I can only deduce that they are. But if we're going to chase the 1% of anything that ever occurs, we're missing the other 99. So I think the biggest thing is not to so much focus on, I don't know how to word this properly. We need to stop focus on sensationalism, and we need to focus on exactly to what Doug just said. We need to focus on what our youth and our women's vulnerabilities are and fix those problems, because the vulnerability is what causes it. I don't care what anybody says. I think that when we sensationalize stuff, when we do the Wayfair, when we do the Pizzagate, when we do the fact that, you know, as an example, Epstein, I love this discussion. There's nothing unique about Jeffrey Epstein. The only thing that's unique about him is he's a millionaire. That's it. He still exploited vulnerable youth. He still had essentially his bottom. He had Giselle, whatever her name is, right. And he created that buffer between him and those young ladies. So, you know, even looking at things like that, you know, hashtag save the children, we really need to be worried about who is on our kids' social media telling them they're pretty. We need to be worried about who's filling that financial void when we're out working extra hours because of you know, maybe COVID or whatever the case may be. So I hate to say don't pay attention to those things, but I think we need to look at the root cause versus the symptoms that are minute symptoms.
Doug, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Joe nailed it.
He nailed it. So this is for Doug. We know that human trafficking is a growing problem in Alabama. What, if any, are the unique characteristics related to human trafficking here?
I don't know that we have any really unique characteristics that are specific to Alabama. I think human trafficking here probably looks a lot like human trafficking, you know, any other place. I mean, we have some things in the state that might make it easier for people to move. Again, it's not a transportation crime, but it is a transient crime. And, you know, just from, you know, the Birmingham area, you know, we've got a straight shot to Atlanta. We've got the convergence of all these major interstates right here in Alabama or in Birmingham. And from Birmingham, you can literally drive anywhere in the country you want to go. You just have to hop on one of those interstates, and you'll get there. I mean, it's a straight shot to Memphis and up to Chicago and across to Dallas and Atlanta, and I mean, you name it. We can, you know, down to New Orleans. You can get there from here. So it makes it easier for people to move. But as far as unique characteristics, I think we probably look a lot like other places, except maybe in the fact that sadly Alabama has kind of been behind the ball, so to speak, in kind of getting its act together to really kind of attack this problem. I mean, when compared to other states, compared to what Texas is doing and other states, we're just pretty far behind. This is a state in which, prostitution was not a crime, a state crime, until 2007. So, it's, we have some catching up to do in terms of our efforts. And I think that's probably one of the big characteristics. It's not so much the characteristic of trafficking; it's really a unique characteristic of the state itself and our response. And I don't think, we even, we're collecting data on sex buyers too. Demographic data, and I don't know that it probably is much different than anywhere else, in the country. A lot's going to obviously depend on the environment and that type of thing. But I don't know about you, Joe, but I think 100% of the sex buyers that we've interviewed here, and we've got hundreds of questionnaires that we've done. They've all said that for them, did
we lose Doug?
that was kind of the gateway. So, but I suspect that that's probably not uncharacteristic of any other place.
Yeah.
We're kind of cutting out there a little bit.
Were you referring to the porn push and buying?
Yeah. So basically what I was saying was, out of the hundreds of questionnaires that we've done with buyers, it's 100% or right at 100% of our sex buyers all said that their desire to ultimately purchase sex, all stemmed from their use or an addiction to porn, over a period of time. That was the gateway that ultimately led them to where they were. Now there were other factors too. I mean, some of them, an unhappy marriage, whatever, lack of affection, they turn to porn no longer does it for them, and they have to go out and purchase it.
So we have another question from an attendee. It's rather long, but let me read it. Can you talk about how children who are sexually abused are more vulnerable to later sexual exploitation or trafficking, either while they are still minors or adults? And then there's a caveat or a statement. The statistic she's seen is that the attendee has seen about 90% of child exploitation / trafficking victims had previously been sexually abused as children. I apologize, I can't read tonight apparently. It's a long question.
That exactly mirrors what we see here.
About 90%?
Actually, the numbers that we have here, adult victims of human trafficking, well over 90%, approaching 100% of those individuals all state that they were sexually exploited, as children.
I agree with that, with one caveat. We see the exact same thing. I would say 95 to 100% of the victims we've come across say, look, I was sexually abused. That does not mean that 100%, that 95% of sexually abused children go on to become trafficking victims. So that's one thing.
Exactly.
I understand that while that is a very large demographic, of sexual abuse, sexually abused children, that again, I would echo Doug. I think probably 100% foster care. You could go right down the line. Yeah. That doesn't mean that number can also be reversed.
Good point. So Joe, I asked Doug the question about human trafficking becoming a growing problem in our state, but I understand it is a growing problem in Texas as well. What are any unique characteristics that you see, if any?
There aren't. No, I definitely agree with what he said 100%. It's funny because as I've continued to do stuff with, the people of Alabama and talk to you guys, it's funny how many of my cases now are starting to come to fruition and get sentences. And I look back at them and they're Dothan, Alabama. I didn't know what Dothan, Alabama was, back then. But how many have that nexus? And I think, to kind of echo what Doug said, Alabama, we all know, is a huge hub for all forms of trafficking or for transportation. And not only transportation, but criminal activity. So as easy as it is to get to you guys and shoot east and west and north and south, I don't think that there's anything unique. You see small little things here and there. Some of the task forces I work with are seeing in the very large cities that traffickers are becoming Uber drivers so that they can actually accept the ride from the victim and then show up. And if they get caught, they're like, hey, I'm quite literally the Uber driver. But that's not happening in all jurisdictions. There's just little small nuances that happen in other places, but by and large, it's the exact same cases I get are quite literally the exact same cases that they're getting out there.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. How many of the, let's see, how many are victims are introduced by family members to sex trafficking? Any ideas there?
I don't know that you could put a number on that. You go back to the sexual abuse, the overwhelming majority of sexual abuse is happening within the household. I don't know how you could measure that.
Yeah, I don't know that you could accurately measure it. I know that our own statistics in the state, not our statistics, not my agency statistics, but statewide statistics, through DHR and that kind of thing. They indicate that the vast majority of child sex trafficking in the state is family-based. It's familial trafficking.
There's also a question, what percentage of victims have disabilities? I understand that that's an increasing number. I don't know how large that number is, but.
I just saw this question recently too at a meeting. I want to say it was through DOJ. And again, do we want to define disability? What is a disability? Is it right. You're in a mental health crisis? Is that, it's so tough. Can we say that, people that have, physical disabilities, I don't see a ton of that. Mental health, a lot, and whether it be prior to being trafficked or the complex trauma that comes from the trafficking that's caused that. I mean, that's tough.
Across Alabama, and I would say across any state, really, there are many different organizations working to raise awareness and provide training about human trafficking. What do you see as the best way to coordinate all these efforts into a viable, cohesive coalition?
Multidisciplinary teams.
I knew that was coming. I love it.
Yep. That's really where that's where it's at. Joe's very familiar with multidisciplinary teams, or what's sometimes known as the enhanced collaborative model. Mm-hmm. But that's really what it is. It's law enforcement, it's victim service providers, healthcare providers, all working together collaboratively to attack this issue, each from a different perspective, each with its own, expertise, but working it collaboratively and collectively.
I'm sorry?
all toward the same, we may have different lanes, but we're all working toward the same goal.
There is someone in our audience wants you to elaborate on traffickers becoming Uber drivers, if you can elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, what better way to try to get out of your trafficking charge than when you get pulled over by the cops for dropping your victim off to be able to say, look, I'm an Uber driver. So it's not that they're becoming Uber drivers because they want to get a career and they want to, get out of trafficking. It's just quite literally that they can sit at the apartment and the victim can click that she needs a ride and he's right there. I mean, Uber measures proximity and, other algorithms. And as soon as he accepts that ride, in theory, he's free and clear because he could show up, drop you off. And if law enforcement is doing a sting and does surveillance and snatches you up, the theory is that you're going to get out of it by showing that you're an Uber driver. I mean, obviously, I think we're all going to do our due diligence as law enforcement, but we have seen an increase in that in some of, kind of going to what Doug was saying, the enhanced collaborative model task forces that I work with. And some of the larger ones, they are seeing that occur.
There was a question, I wasn't intentionally overlooking it, just my eye didn't catch on it. If you know which parlors, massage parlors are illicit, how do they remain open? I know that's a tough one.
Yeah, I know Joe's got experience with this too. We've actually shut down several this year. Getting prosecutions on these cases aren't often very easy. The workers generally, are not all that cooperative. The organizations, the criminal organizations that operate these massage parlors, they're constantly changing ownership or changing names on business licenses, that kind of thing. So they're not easy. They're not easy cases. Plus, if we need to show that there's criminal activity taking place inside, we either have to get a confidential informant or a source or somebody to go in, because law enforcement's not going to go in, and participate in that kind of activity. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. So again, we try and work with our state and local partners. We work with, with code enforcement, whatever we can do, to go in, find violations, and shut these people down, either from, if we can make a criminal case, great. But if not, if we can at least shut them down from a regulatory standpoint, levy some fines, that kind of thing, that's what we'll do. The federal prosecutions on these cases, they're few and far between. I mean, we've had them here, but they're very difficult, time-consuming cases, for us to make.
Thanks for that. This is for both of you, and I'll start with Joe, if you don't mind. Can you speak about the different organizations that are using the hashtag Save the Children? You mentioned that earlier. Are they legitimate in what they're doing?
I mean, we could try to split hairs to define legitimacy. I think they're well-meaning. I think people are miseducated and are following the wrong things. So hashtag Save the Children, I think, is probably well-meaning. I like to call the majority of this wrong execution of the right idea. We have the right idea. We want to stop human trafficking. We want to stop child sex trafficking. We want to stop child, exploitation, but we just don't know how to do it. And I think as a society, we tend to latch on to the group. We latch on to what everybody else is doing. And when everybody else is banging the drum and carrying the torches, we like to grab our torch and follow them. So I would just say, you know, to honestly stop if you see the hashtags, if you see those things, or you see the groups, just stop for a minute and think about it and try to do a little independent research. You know, we had one pop up yesterday. Somebody asked me about donating to, and they, you know, quote, saved like 1,800 children. You know, 1,800 children, and we've never heard of you. You know, come on.
Understand.
So yeah, that's my take on it.
I get it. Doug, you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I echo exactly what Joe was saying. Yeah, I mean, not saying that these people aren't trying to do the right thing. And there's nothing wrong and, you know, inherently wrong with the hashtag Save the Children. It's a great idea. But like Joe said, it's really about the execution.
So back to multidisciplinary teams, Doug, I'm going to let you have this. One of our audience participants, whatever, wants a follow-up on how can we in Alabama develop more teams through the state?
That's a very, very good question. So we only, right now in the state of Alabama, we only have 2 operational task forces that are actively working human trafficking cases. One of those is the West Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force. The other one is the Birmingham metro area child sex trafficking multidisciplinary team. And both of them work very collaboratively with victim service providers, healthcare, DHR, you know, et cetera. The use, MDT use, or the use of multidisciplinary teams has been around, you know, for a couple of decades or more. I mean, but typically it was used in child welfare cases, child abuse and neglect investigations. And really the use within the human trafficking arena is really only about 10 years old. And working collaboratively with law enforcement can sometimes be a challenge if you don't have the right leadership. A lot of law enforcement is used to a very autocratic or authoritarian form of leadership where people give orders and you follow those orders and don't ask questions. That doesn't typically work well with victim service organizations, NGOs, that kind of thing, because that's not how they operate.
Right.
And, you know, everybody might be working toward the same purpose, but everybody still has an allegiance to their organization. And so there's a barrier there that you have to overcome. So the hope is that the task forces that we have here in the state, that the 2 will be a model, and I think they are a model for the rest of the state. And I think you'll see some things coming over the next year here in the state of Alabama that will increase the use of MDTs throughout the state as a way of actually targeting or attacking this issue.
One of our participants says that the children's advocacy centers already have MDTs in place. Can we tap into that? Sounds like something to investigate to me. So
the MDTs that the CACs have, they are multidisciplinary teams, but they're typically the MDTs at the CACs are really designed, again, for child abuse and neglect, child sexual abuse, you know, that kind of thing, rather than for combating, you know, human trafficking. So it's the same concept. It's the exact same concept. It's just the application is slightly different. But that's really how the MDT world got its start, was through CACs a few decades ago. Sounds like something to investigate. Let's put it that way for future.
There have been many times when an accused trafficker is charged with a lesser non-human trafficking crime just in order to get a conviction and get the trafficker off the street. Since these are still human trafficking related, how do we capture these cases in our data collection systems in order to see a complete picture of human trafficking activity? Any ideas there?
I think that's dependent on each agency for one. You know, for me, I agree 100%. I am all about alternative charges. Some people chase the term human trafficking because they want a 25-year sentence, for instance, which is fine and dandy. But if you can't get that, you might as well take the 15 on the promotion of prostitution.
I understand.
Yeah. So we code all of ours on intake as human trafficking, regardless of what the charge is. So it could come in as trafficking, but it gets charged as money laundering. It's still a trafficking investigation. So I think we need to quit worrying about the tracking of the charge versus the tracking of the investigation.
Right.
Yeah, and that's exactly how we do ours too.
Good.
Nationally, it has you can't look at the prosecution data, the charging data from the courts, whether state or federal, because that's not going to give you an accurate picture of what went down.
That's good to know, because I would have thought that those were not going to be included because of the conviction not being human trafficking, that it would simply just be whatever the charge was, money laundering, as you mentioned, Joe. Okay, next question. And this is for you, Joe. In your travels across the US, have you seen any practices, programs, legislation, et cetera, that can help us here in Alabama?
Ooh, you know,
very broad.
It is very broad. I oftentimes point out, and I do that honestly, meaning I think that the work that Doug and them are doing out there is absolutely phenomenal. And I think that it is really setting trends. You know, I work with ECM funded task forces all over the country. So I see some of what I would call best practices, and I would see some of what I think is absurd. And I think that what's going on out in Alabama is amazing. One thing I would bring up when it comes to legislation, because I know you mentioned that, we got to remember a few things. I could give you a unicorn law that says human trafficking, you know, we can do this and they'll go to prison for life if they're a trafficker, and the victim will mysteriously become well in the next week. But if we're not even using our existing laws, they're completely pointless. So everybody likes to talk about legislation, but if we're not enforcing what we have already, you know, there's TVPA is a wonderful thing. I'm sure, you know, throughout the state of Alabama, even your state statutes are comparable to most states. If we're not even applying those on a local level, I saw kind of a horror story come out recently out there, and it was misapplication. You know, and if you do that, the new legislation's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. So again, just the short answer is no, or the long answer is no, because I really follow a lot of what you guys are doing out there, and it's probably much more advanced than what you are giving yourself credit for.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you. Doug, do you want to add anything to that? Do you see any gaps in legislation or things that we need to be doing other than MDTs, obviously?
Well, I think, you know, kind of to Joe's point, you've got to use the legislation that you've got. You know, we also take a lot of cases and prosecute them at the state level rather than the federal level, because of the way that the state statute is written. We may be able to more easily prosecute a human trafficking case in state court than in federal court. And the sentencing guidelines that the state has versus the federal, they mirror each other. So we can still get a good sentence at the state level, you know, in a human trafficking case. In Alabama, you know, under state law, a minor for the purposes of human trafficking is anyone under the age of 19. Whereas at the federal level, it's 18. So if we have a victim who was 18 years, 364 days old, we can still prosecute that case at the state level as a child sex trafficking case and put that person in prison, for 25 years or more. So we still get the same bang for the buck, depending upon where we prosecute the case. But I would say if there's one piece, if there was one thing that we could do, and whether it's a legislative fix or if it's a procedural fix in the courts, it would be to apply the law in such a way that it's more favorable to victims. We try everything we can to not get our victims to have to testify. And sometimes that's why we use, those additional charges or those other charges so that they don't have to testify. But I think if we had a law, I think if our laws were written in such a way, or the procedures could be applied in such a way as they do with children, where children in a child sex trafficking case, minors don't have to testify for us to get a conviction. If we could somehow overcome that hurdle, with adults, I honestly think that would probably help and boost the number of prosecutions that we do get for the substantive violation.
Very good. I have a question here from a participant. Are the sex selling sites still really a thing? With Backpage getting shut down and traffickers knowing that law enforcement monitors sites like that, are they still really being used?
Definitely. Yeah, I can tell you right now that there are at least 30 different sites or apps that are being used to sell sex in Alabama. So the number of those sites actually went up after Backpage was shut down.
Joe, same thing in Texas?
Yeah, I agree. Every state that I work in, I see the exact same thing. And here's the harsh reality of it, and we'll just call a spade a spade. Law enforcement, not between what Doug and them are doing out there and not what we're doing here, but in other agencies, is failing miserably. And they're misidentifying victims and they're arresting them for prostitution. So essentially the traffickers are just running amok because they don't have to worry because cops aren't arresting them. So yeah, absolutely. You can sell it right on the internet and never have, I say never, if you do it in either one of our two states, but in many of the other states, especially California, you don't really have anything to worry about. So the internet's alive and well.
So this is a question from me because I've been paying attention to sugar babies. And the University of Alabama shows up in a matrix, if you will, table, whatever you want to call it, chart, as number 6 in the country for having sugar babies. Sugar babies being co-eds selling themselves basically for tuition money, make it easy for them to have a nice residence or a nice car while they're going to school and paying tuition, and they get out and they don't have large bills of tuition to have to pay back. What are you guys seeing? Doug, you want to start?
Well, the short answer, I think that's a win, because depending upon which site that you look at, just 3 years ago, we were like number 1 or number 3 in the nation. So the fact that we dropped to number 6, not great, but it's still good. And a lot of that's been, due to education and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's a problem. And whether there's sex involved or not, these young women are still putting themselves in a very precarious, vulnerable position, where they can be, harmed or exploited, through that, through those sugar baby, sugar daddy, type websites. Again, the reality is, they can make a lot of money. And, it's, I wish they could find alternative means, to make that money.
Sure.
But in most of those situations too, we also have to face the reality that they are not being forced to sell themselves on those sites. I mean, some of that is a personal choice.
Sure.
That they make. That's not to say that they aren't harmed or they aren't exploited or criminally, that there aren't bad things that happen. But if somebody needs to make money to buy a $40 bag of meth and they decide to sell themselves on the street to somebody for $40 so they can go buy a bag of meth or a bag of heroin, that's not human trafficking. That's prostitution. If you need money for college and you agree, or you decide to go out with a wealthy individual, for a night on the town, that's a personal choice. And so we have to be careful to kind of draw that distinction, as well. So that's not to say that there can't be trafficking involved in some of that. But there's a lot of personal choice in there as well.
Joe, you want to add anything?
For one, I'm absolutely shocked that that's actually a number. I didn't realize Alabama was 6, and I really didn't realize you guys were ahead of that before then. I agree to a large extent. I think that when we look at sugar babies, just like anything else, we need to look at sugar babies and we be looking at sugar daddies. And
absolutely.
The thing about it is are they doing that voluntarily? Yeah, I agree 100%. Most oftentimes that's voluntarily. So we try to figure out what can we do to fix the sugar baby, phenomenon. We fix the sugar daddies. And if we can get away from that, and, quit worrying about what they're doing to get their money and focus on the guys that are exploiting them, I think we need to focus our time on that. But again, to echo what Doug said, it doesn't mean it's human trafficking. And one thing that people have a hard time understanding is prostitution is not human trafficking. They're two completely different things. So again, mine and his focus are on trafficking, not necessarily prostitution.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to say we're out of time for tonight, but the North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force will present a second webinar in this series during the next quarter, so be watching for the announcement. First of all, a big thank you to our speakers. Doug and Joe, what an informative evening. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being with us, and thank you for your time and for all that you do to fight sex trafficking. I also want to thank the task force board members, Pam, Bo, Rick, and Deborah, who worked behind the scenes to make this webinar happen. And to all of you who joined us tonight, I want to thank you for being here tonight and wonderful questions. Thank you so much for submitting those. If you would like, please go to our website at www.stnow.org and make a donation to the North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force. Your donations will go a long way to help fund future awareness activities, educational, I can't talk suddenly, educational events such as additional webinars and other future projects. Thank you, everybody, and good night.